Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Kitty and I'm an academic doctor working in the UK, and welcome to this Q&A meeting with coffee. Today, on the day of filming, Tuesday the 2nd of August, this is my last day as an F2 doctor, and tomorrow I will be moving formally onto core surgical training as an ACF ST1 in vascular surgery, so I'm extremely excited. More than that though, tomorrow is also known as Black Wednesday or Changeover Day, which is when all the junior doctors in the country basically move around. There's a bunch of new F1s coming who have just qualified for medical school this year, so they're going to be an entirely new cohort of doctors coming to the hospital. Previously, I've made a video about the top 10 tips that I wish I knew coming into F1, so do check that video out if you haven't already. But over the last few days, I've collated some questions from you guys, doing a bit of a Q&A on Instagram about any questions that you have, basically about being a doctor, about life, about foundation training, about career stuff. So today, I'm just going to be going through some of those questions and answering them. Broadly, I've kind of split them into clinical questions about being a doctor in F1 and F2, general questions about the job and being a doctor, as well as some career questions as well. So let's dive right into it. So starting with clinical questions, any useful books or apps that you would recommend for a new F1 doctor? Yes, so the Oxford Handbook for Foundation Doctors is quite a useful sort of overview of things that you might see as an on-call. I did have this book electronically downloaded onto my phone just in case I needed it, but I found that actually when you're doing the job, there's not particularly enough time for me to look at it, but it's quite useful to have there and as a sort of background reading when you get home or something at the end of the day if there was something that you weren't sure about. The BNF is a must-have app on your phone. It's super useful to search up what drugs you're giving, what the dose is, what are the indications, what are the contraindications and interactions, so must have that. Induction is a really good app as well. It's basically where you can input your hospital that you're working in, and it shows you all the bleep and contact numbers for different teams and registrars or junior doctors. So really useful to be able to find someone without having to go through switchboard every time. It saves you a bit of time. Pocket Doctor is another one. This is a paid app, but essentially it goes through some of the main emergencies and acute scenarios that you should know as an F1 and to treat when you're on call. So things like ECG changes, hyperkalemia, and things like that. Just sort of really simple, easy to follow steps. And of course, actually, one of the most useful thing you can familiarize yourself with as an F1 is your local trust guidelines, because often there is a lot of stuff on there about microbiology guidelines, as well as kind of the algorithms to follow in acute scenarios such as a suspected ACS or STEMI, or again, hyperkalemia, hypercalcemia. Usually trusts have their own set of guidelines and it's all very useful. So I do recommend just finding out where that is. So the next question is more of a sort of statement, but I'm scared of prescribing and writing discharge letters and TTOs because they might not be checked by a consultant before the patient is discharged, and I'm worried that the GP might not have enough time to go over them, so I'm worried that my mistakes can translate to patient care. Very valid concern, but what you've got to remember is actually in the hospital there is an excellent fail-safe mechanism for all prescriptions, and they come in the life-saving form of your friendly ward pharmacist. So actually over the last 2 years I genuinely have not met a pharmacist that's not been friendly or unhelpful. They are literally your best friend as an F1 on the ward. They are so knowledgeable about all the medications, the local guidelines, what you should prescribe, how to prescribe it, how many times they need to take it a day, what are the dose adjustments when the patient has renal failure and everything. They are just so helpful, and actually their day job involves going around the ward checking people's drug charts to make sure the prescriptions are correct, to make sure the drugs are ordered, and they also double check all the TTOs you sent. So it's not like you write the TTO and no one ever looks at it. Usually the pharmacist will screen it before it is sort of finally approved and sent off to the GP, and they're really good at picking up mistakes. So don't worry, there are fail-safe mechanisms, and if you're ever not sure, ask the pharmacist. They're so helpful. Okay, and then there are a couple questions about any tips about managing on calls, tips for starting on nights as an F1, any particular advice about doing on-calls on your own. So obviously being on call the first time by yourself is really daunting. Usually out of hours there is a bit of a skeleton crew, and that you're probably the only F1 taking care of certain wards and certain patients, and it can feel quite intimidating. But don't forget, you're never actually alone. You usually have an SHO or a registrar, and of course the registrar has their own consultant as well. So there is a very clear chain of escalation, and every time that you're unsure about something, or if the patient's acutely unwell, just escalate, just ask your senior. Everyone knows that you're a new doctor, and everyone would prefer you to ask more times than you need and be safe, rather than leave an unwell patient alone with the incorrect treatment. So just make sure you always escalate. My other tip about being out doing sort of out of hours work is making sure that you're actually just doing what is necessary. So remember that overnight, or out of hours, your goal is to just keep the patients alive so that the next day they can be seen by a consultant and have a more definitive plan. You're not there to fix all their problems. You're just there to treat the acutely unwell patients, make sure the urgent scans and things are chased, things like discharge summaries or rewriting a drug chart for drugs that the patient is having tomorrow afternoon. That's not urgent. You don't need to do that out of hours. Just focus on keeping people alive and escalate to your seniors when necessary. In a sort of related sense, do you have any tips for recovering post-nights? So everyone will sort of develop their own sort of routine for recovering post-nights, and it's quite shocking the first couple of times you do it, because you're just not used to flipping your day and nights around. My recommendation, this is how I personally do it, some people might not do, but on the day that you finish your nights, I tend to try and keep myself awake for as long as possible. I might take a light nap for maximum an hour or two when I come back from work, and then try and keep myself awake for the rest of the day, because this means that basically by the end of that day you'll be really tired, and then you have a really good deep sleep to sort of replenish the tiredness that you have. And this is actually one of the lecturers from university told us this as well, and she was like a sleep study expert, so I would trust her. The other thing is to just sort of accept that the day post night is written off. Don't worry about doing anything on that day. Accept that you're going to be a complete waste man, just on the sofa, watching YouTube, watching TV, whatever. You're not going to be doing anything productive that day, and that's completely fine. Like, you've just done a series of night shifts, is really taxing, and now you switched to your entire circadian rhythm around. Like, that is not easy. So don't try to do too much. Just make sure you try and correct your sleep schedule as much as possible in whatever way works for you. Take it easy and you'll be fine. Okay, so I think that's all the kind of clinical questions that we've got, and there's some general questions about F1, F2. So the first one is, I'm on my shadowing period at the moment, and I'm so tired already after work. Does the tiredness ever get better? So yes, it does get better. I think you probably never actually stop feeling tired after work, because it is taxing to be on your feet all day, particularly after an on-call shift. I think as an F1 in particular, it's a very steep learning curve. For a lot of people, it's probably the first time that they have worked so intensely and regularly for a job. And so, everything is new, everything is stressful. You have to learn so many new systems, so many ways to refer people and talk to people, and how to deal with patients, and learn where everything is on the ward, and who to speak to about this and who to speak to about that. And I think all of those things just creates a very stressful environment. And when I start an F1 for the first sort of 3 months or so, I think I just couldn't do anything else. I just go to work, do my work, just about managed to feed myself 3 meals a day, and then that was it. I didn't have the energy to get anything else done after work was done. But I think after a while you do get used to it. You develop a good routine, and once you stop being so terrified of everything and having to worry about how do I do this, how do I do that, and you just get on with the job, things do get a lot easier. So yes, the tiredness will get better. You probably won't ever be in a place where you would say I'm not tired after a shift, but you do get used to it. Okay, next one. How do you manage a work-life balance? The $1 million question. This is actually a difficult one that I'm personally not very good at myself. I need to remind myself every now and then, or have someone else remind me every now and then, to just relax. I think clinically, as a doctor compared to when you're a medical student, it becomes slightly easier to leave work at work, in the sense that, you're rotated to work 8 till 5, therefore you work 8 till 5, and after that you don't have to do anything else. When you first start and actually still ongoing, whenever you have sick patients and things, you might find it difficult to let things be. Your mind might keep wandering to that patient that you saw last night, whether you managed them correctly, how are they doing now, are they getting better? From that point of view, again, it does get easier over time, but what helped me get through that feeling of really worrying about all the patients that I've seen and whether I did the right plan and things was being assured that there is an out of hours team for a reason in a hospital. There is always an F1 covering out of hours, and then their seniors and their seniors. So actually patients are in good hands in that there is someone to look after them all the time, and if they were to acutely deteriorate, then you would trust your colleague to be able to handle that. What I find actually more difficult about work-life balance is in F1 and F2, and indeed throughout your entire medical training and career, there's lots of extra so-called optional but actually sort of necessary things that you have to do, like exams, learning, research, audits, CV building, and all this type of thing. And most of the time you have to do that all in your own time. If you get too caught up in it, it's really easy to then really lose your work-life balance to doing clinical work and then all this extra stuff on the side. And I think, some of the things that I found helpful is setting SMART goals. So for example, if you knew that you want to aim for surgical training, read up on the criteria for core surgical training early, so you have an expectation of what you might need to achieve in the next couple of years in order to apply. And then, unless you have a genuine research interest or anything like that, most of the time it is a tick boxing exercise, unfortunately. So just do what you need to do to hit the points you need to hit, and don't try to be clever and do too much else, because you will be swamped with the amount of things you have to do. Make sure you take all your leave, your annual leave, your study leave and things, because they don't roll over every year and they don't roll over to the next rotation. So make sure you do get your time off. Check your rota is, compliant with EWTD. Get in touch with the BMA to check it if you're not sure. Have a really good support group. And yeah, it's really difficult to have a good work-life balance. You do end up working a lot all the time, but it is possible. You just have to be really mindful about it, I think. Okay, so the next question. Have you ever cried on shift? Wow, these questions are really difficult. So I don't think I've ever properly cried on shift, but I have had a few occasions where I was close, I think, to crying on shifts or potentially breaking down. And usually it's not because a patient's really unwell and I didn't know what to do, because you could always escalate it to someone and there's someone to talk to. It's usually because colleagues have been unkind. Obviously not going to name drop anything, but I had a really, really busy night shift covering stroke neurology and neurosurgery once. I had literally been non-stop all night. There had been 8 admissions on top of the usual kind of out-of-hours stuff with people being unwell that I had to go see them and sort them out. And at the end of a shift, there was one non-urgent task that I've put off for about 2 hours. And by the end of my shift, when I finally got around to doing it, one of the nurses on the ward just sort of made like a really snarky comment about my decision making, and it made me really upset. I thought, I worked so hard this evening. I've run around between 4 different wards taking care of 30 patients each in each ward, so I wasn't always there. And clearly people had conceptions about how busy I was and the fact that I was just putting off work when in fact I've been running around all night. So things like that is really upsetting. And the other occasion I think was I was really, really struggling to get a cannula in this quite septic sick patient, and my SHO and my registrar were both in theatres, so no one could really come and help me. So I called the anaesthetics on call to try and get some help, because I didn't really know what else to do, and they basically just yelled at me down the phone saying it's disrespectful for an F1 to call the anaesthetic reg to come and do a cannula when my own seniors haven't tried, which like, yes, fair enough, that is the correct escalation order, but just the way that they said it was not very nice. And again, that was on the backdrop of a very busy on-call shift where multiple patients were kicking off and I was doing lots and lots of things. So more of that story, be kind to your colleagues, and one day when you're a senior, just remember how it felt to be an F1, stressed out on the ward, not knowing exactly what to do for lots of things, and just being kind to one another, have some compassion. That's all I can say. Oof, so that was all very heavy. So moving on to some lighter, easier questions. When do you get paid as a new doctor? How's the pay work? So I recently made a video about the income and expenses of junior doctors. So I explained in there how the base pay and the kind of additional night premiums and everything work, and an idea about how much I made and what I spent my money on in terms of career stuff. Your first paycheck comes at the end of August. So there is a couple of weeks when you first start work where you're not sort of getting paid. So just something to be aware of. Final general question, how do you feel about finishing F2? Extremely relieved, actually, and very excited to move on. I think because I had an idea of what I wanted to do, and I've worked very hard towards what I wanted to do and to get onto surgical training since sort of late medical school for the last few years, I feel like oftentimes you can sort of just feel a little bit like rota fodder, being shipped around to different rotations that you're not necessarily interested in, and I don't mind doing medical rotations or jobs that I don't envisage having a career in at all, as long as there is good learning opportunities and it helps me to be a better doctor. But unfortunately, as it is in the NHS, the busiest jobs often end up with little to no educational / training opportunities, which is usually the reason why I become really upset with them. And when I fail to see any educational opportunities or anything that will make me a better doctor and a better surgeon to contribute to my career goal, I find that a bit frustrating. So I am glad to have finished F2 and moving on to surgical training. Right, so finally, career questions. So there was quite a few questions I received about asking about how to do research and audits as an F1. So definitely possible. During the first few months, you are probably too engaged with the clinical aspect of learning to do the job and learning to be a doctor to worry about any of this stuff. And I would say, at the end of the day, you need to be a good clinician first before thinking about doing any of this other stuff. So don't worry too much about it at the start of F1. However, if you want to do it, it is fairly easy to get involved in audits and research. Usually departments have lots of ideas about what they want to do to improve their service, or the consultants are best placed to understand the evidence that's available and what needs to be improved. So if you're interested in doing any of those, I would identify a supervisor from either your specialty of choice or just approach a consultant from your department that you're working in. You want to ideally be supervised by someone who is quite research active. What I mean by that is if you do sort of a quick Google and PubMed search, you probably want someone who has had sort of 5 publications a year, something like that. And you can just approach them and ask, I want to get involved. Do you have any ideas about projects that I can do, audits that I can do? And they usually will have some idea, and then you can just do it. Next question, what are the best ways to network? So that's a really good question, and actually one of the harder things to do well, I think, but it's definitely very valuable, and that it can open up a lot of opportunities, both in terms of sort of clinical side of things, in terms of like who wanted a clinical fellow job in a year, or if you ever wanted to work with a department in the future, and also from an academic point of view, because the more people you network with, the more the more they sort of offer opportunities to do things with them, which is great. I would say, when you're at work, chat to your consultant and your registrar colleagues, take an interest in the work that they do, the research that they're involved in, the conferences that they attend, and again, you can ask about getting involved in any opportunities for audits and research and anything like that. A lot of networking happens on collaborative projects as well, so if there is like a big collaborative project, perhaps trust-wide or regional-wide, or even national, like via Star Search or a collaborative network like that, it's always worth getting involved, particularly if you're new to research. When you're attending conferences and courses, just talk to people, ask about what they do, ask about the research that they've done. If you're particularly interested, you can even, ask if you can contact them in the future. Other things is kind of like joining a journal club, starting a teaching program, joining specialty trainee groups, which is always useful in, again, just getting to know people. And, I always find that if you make a good impression, people do think of you in the future. Or, if you have put yourself forward as someone who has the time and the availability to do a project, then people tend to remember you and they might contact you again in the future. So networking, really important. Okay, next question. What made you choose vascular surgery as a specialty? And there's a couple other questions about how did you find what specialty you liked. Really good question. So for me, I think surgery was one of those things that I always wanted to do. I liked being able to do things practically with my hands. I liked being able to see the results of things that I've done immediately. And quite frankly, I think it adds a lot of interesting elements to your work compared to being a medical consultant when most of your work is done in clinic and the wards. So that's sort of what drew me to surgery. The things I liked about vascular surgery is I kind of fell into it incidentally where I did a project. I managed to get involved in theatre quite a lot, and it's one of those surgeries that's just really fascinating. I really like the pathology behind it. I really like the surgery that they do. It's just beautiful surgery. And the fact that you get to operate all over the body, whether that's a carotid surgery, which is beautiful, and abdominal aortic aneurysm repair, which is just like gritty, and kind of lower limb stuff, which is all very intricate, and you get to make a real difference to people's quality of life. That's sort of why I like vascular surgery. And once I discovered that I actually quite enjoy academia and research, it's also one of those surgical specialties that lends itself very well to research as well, and it's very research active and has got a really good close-knit community. So for me personally, that's sort of why I went to vascular. I think in terms of finding out your specialties, so obviously you have your rotations in foundation times to go around, ask people, what their day-to-day life is like, what consultant life is like, because ultimately that's what you're going to be spending your years doing. What they liked about it, what they don't like about it, and make sure you take your taster days as well. As an F1, you are entitled to 5 days of taster days, and as an F2, you have about 5 days of study leave per rotation that you can use as taster days if you wish. So get in contact perhaps with departments that and specialties that isn't as part of your rotation that you might be interested in, and go spend a few days seeing what they do. And ultimately, attending conferences, courses, networking, that's all part of sort of finding out your specialty as well. Okay, last question. How do you stay confident and persistent on chasing your goal to be a surgeon? Really good and difficult question. And I think lots of us have had this thought, regardless of which specialty we're aiming in. Unfortunately, foundation years can sometimes feel like a bit of a drag. As I said earlier, you can feel like you're being thrown around as rota fodder and a jobs monkey who doesn't add very much value to patient care, and you feel like you've gone through 5 years of medical school to not make any clinical decisions and spend your day being somebody's secretary tracing some scans and blood results. And unfortunately, it does have a tendency to make people become quite disillusioned, quite jaded and cynical very quickly, which is not a good thing. And there are lots of times that makes us all rethink whether we actually want to spend the time and the energy pursuing competitive specialties. So particularly, when you're rotating around to, again, a medical job that you don't think is related to your learning or isn't related to your career. And indeed, when I was doing GP as an F2, I often find it very frustrating because I feel like I can't see the immediate connection of what I'm learning and doing in GP to a career in surgery in secondary care in a hospital. And what kept me going over the last 2 years whenever I felt this way was actually being able to do things that are in my control that I know will make me a good candidate when I apply for surgical training. So when I'm studying for the MRCS exams, when I'm doing an audit, when I'm doing a research project that I know will boost my CV and therefore make it easier for me to apply and get into surgical training on the first try, which I did. That made me feel a lot better. And the other thing often that I found rejuvenated my passion in surgery as well is if I'm on a medical job and it's starting to really grate on me that we're doing the same ward round every day that lasts, 5 hours or whatever. Actually having some taster days where I get to go to theatre has really made a huge difference, because every time that I've done that, I go, and this is why I want to do surgery. Like, this is why I was interested in the first place. This is why I wanted to be a doctor. This is what I'm working towards. And I think it really, really helps. So if you have anything particular that you really like to do from a clinical point of view, do take the taster days and go and do that, because it is really helpful. And finally, I think one of the really important things that, again, kept me going type thing when it comes to career planning and being persistent is having a really good relationship with a surgical team. So because I went to university and did my foundation training in the same city, I've maintained a relationship with this surgical team for quite a long time. And as a result, that's afforded me some perks and benefits in that, if I wanted to go to theatre, it's very easy for me to ask the consultant or the registrar to see if I can go that day. And equally, it's allowed me to have lots of chats with different people at different stages of training about careers, about, how to plan my career, about the things that I need to do, things that I don't need to do, how to develop myself into a good trainee and things like that. And this was a really big, important part, I think, of keeping my passion for surgery going and making sure I'm doing the right things and having an advice and being able to, get different perspectives on lots of different things. I think ultimately surgical training is really difficult. It's a really long training pathway. It's really intense, and for all the memes and stereotypes about it, oftentimes you do have to compete with your peers to get theatre time. And sometimes that does end up with some people coming in on their off days to operate, and if the case lasts longer because the patient is unwell or it's a complex case, you might have to stay late. And it did sort of affirm that, look, you really have to be completely committed in order to complete surgical training, as it were. But I feel like that must be true for many other specialties as well, because regardless, the training pathway is just grueling for a lot of different specialties. So you have to find some way to keep yourself going. And if there was ever a time you find that, actually I can't be asked to do this, I think that's probably a moment for you to reflect on whether you actually want to go down that route to be that specialty. Just some food for thought. And that's the end of the video and the end of the questions. Thank you so much to everyone who sent in a question, and to those of you who've actually messaged me questions over the last 2 years when I've been running this YouTube channel. Good luck to all of you who are starting as new F1s come Wednesday. You will all be amazing. You will be surprised at how much you learn and how quickly you learn it and how quickly you adapt to your new workplace, and you'll all be excellent doctors. And I look forward to working with all of you in the future. That's it for now. I'll see you next time.